Hi, everyone. Welcome to a new episode of The Heart Speaks. I'm your host, Chloe Valdary. In this podcast, I will be speaking with Winston Marshall, former banjo player of the world-renowned band Mumford and Sons, which, as some of you may know, is actually one of my all-time favorite bands ever. We spoke about many interesting topics, including the ethics of nationalism, including Christianity and my relationship to Christianity, as well as other riveting topics that you will be surely excited to hear. One quick note, I was in the middle of moving offices when I filmed this podcast, and unfortunately, I could not use my camera, and so I had to use just regular Zoom through my computer, and so both the quality of the sound and the screen is not the best, but I promise you the content is still pretty dope. So without further ado, here's Winston Marshall on the Heart Speaks podcast. It sounds like you've been making the rounds a lot in terms of having conversations with people. I was looking at your Twitter this morning to sort of catch up, and that's the vibe that I was getting. Is that true?
Yeah, well, thank you so much for inviting me. And I feel like I've been very slow because you invited me a while ago and we met in New York. I'm now speaking, assuming that this is part of the show, by the way.
Yeah, it is.
Okay,
it's very informal, if you couldn't tell.
Okay. So I'm giving extra details, assuming that people won't know, even though you will know, obviously. Yeah. But you and I met in January in New York, I think. Yeah. And I'd come across you and your writing, I think in 2020. And
okay.
I was hoping to meet you anyway, and we met at this dinner, and I didn't expect to see you there, and that was awesome. And why I found you interesting is that I think I came across some of your tweets, and I thought I liked that you were kind of again you were dispelling or breaking up herd mentality on whatever issues were hot in 2020. But then I looked into you, and I think on your handle you had, because your theory of enchantment is anti-racist training, and at the time I think I just read Robin DiAngelo's book
White Fragility,
White Fragility, and so a word like anti-racist I think I got triggered or something.
It threw you off. Yeah,
I was like, what? What's going on here? But it was good because your thinking is very original and hard to pin down. And then when we spoke in New York, you got to explain your program, and I thought, I'm fully behind this. And if this is what anti-racist training is, I think more of it. I loved that it was. There's such good faith in your approach to it. It's about appreciating that there's probably deeper psychological things going on, and it's not about creating enemies or rather creating goody baddies. It's more about engaging with the individual on a really emotional and human level. How's everything going with the program?
It's going really well. I mean, theory of enchantment, I said to a friend the other day, theory of enchantment was really an attempt to make myself whole. And then it just happened to become this kind of, it happened to take on a life of its own. But that's ultimately its origin story. And it's going well. I mean, we have a lot of clients and a growing batch of clients as well. And we really think it's going to take off, hopefully, as the number one, hopefully, anti-racism approach. And it's very nuanced because the human being is a very complex, nuanced being. And it's very much rooted in an appreciation of that and for that. And this idea that the human being is constantly becoming. The human being is not a static, fixed thing, but rather constantly becoming dynamic being. Emphasis on the being part. I think we've lost sight of that, of what that word really suggests. in our lexicon. So yeah, it's going really well.
When you say it started as trying to make yourself whole, what do you mean by that? What was happening then?
So at the time, there's a lot going on, but one of the things that was, I think, very resonant with me was I was breaking away from the religious upbringing that I had had. So I grew up Christian, but very much non-traditional Christian. So I grew up as a Christian that was observing a lot of Jewish holidays on the one hand, and then on the other hand was also not observing mainstream Christian holidays like Christmas and Easter. And the church I grew up in was also extremely conservative in a dogmatic sense, but like very, very extreme right wing. And I had an encounter in college right before I went to the Wall Street Journal to work on the theory of enchantment. I'd had an encounter in college with a liberal professor who was also agnostic. So I automatically assumed that she was like persona non grata, basically. And there was this film that she had us watch. The name of the class was like Anthropology of Religion or something like that. And there was a film she had us watch, which was a documentary about evangelical Christians. And it didn't portray the people very well. And the next day I got back to class and there was this atheist in the class who started ranting against these people. And my agnostic liberal professor started to defend the evangelical Christians, which was a totally paradoxical thing that I wasn't expecting to happen. And it totally shattered my paradigm, because my paradigm, I was just putting people in boxes. If you belong to this category, then you're good. If you belong to this category, then you're bad. And she totally shattered that. And so that really, I think, was the catalyst for the theory of enchantment, ultimately, because I was realizing that I was caricaturing people and I was also caricaturing myself. And if you grow up with an existential framework that basically says that the meaning of life is the way you're categorizing people, and then that shatters, you're basically in a free fall, and you have to learn how to reconstruct yourself or make sense of your identity in a whole new way. And so that was really a big impetus for creating the theory of enchantment.
So how did you get from there to actually starting to being at the Wall Street Journal then? And
well, at the time, so my major was international studies, and I was focused on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And at the time, I was writing not a lot, but I was writing articles about this topic and also doing Israel advocacy work on my campus. And so I had begun to be noticed by different people in the field, as they say. And long story short, Brett Stevens ended up becoming my mentor. And he told me to apply for what's called the Bartley Fellowship Program at the Wall Street Journal. And I did, and I got in. And that's how I was able to work at the Wall Street Journal on, first of all, articles about foreign policy in general, but then eventually the theory of enchantment thesis that I wrote for the last 9 months that I was at the Journal.
What's this? It sounds like a Jews for Jesus type background.
So
what is the church? Is it a big what denomination is it? What?
So it's not Jews for Jesus. We didn't consider ourselves Jewish. It's non-denominational. It's more similar to Seventh-day Adventists, if you're familiar with that denomination. So Seventh-day Adventist is a small sect of Christianity that they call themselves Seventh Day because they go to church on Saturday instead of Sunday. And basically, I think the common theme in a lot of these different smaller Christian sects is that they basically follow the Old Testament as opposed to sort of saying that the Old Testament is done away with. So that was a common thing growing up.
Okay, and so then that developed into a kind of appreciation for Israel as a country.
Exactly.
And
that developed into an appreciation for Israel and a real allergy to anti-Semitism.
Huh. And you told me a story about when we met in January about it was anti-Semitism specifically that you're experiencing in America, that the kind of anti-racist idea was that was the kind of seed of the anti-racist program. Is that right?
So two things were happening in my life when I when I wrote about Theory of Enchantment. The first thing was what I just described. The second thing that was happening was, I think, something like I was seeing anti-Semitism develop in, or first of all, I was seeing it in the news. So I was seeing it was happening in France. There was like shootings in Toulouse at the time. This was 2012. There was talk about the Iran deal, and you saw the Ayatollahs sort of saying that they're going to wipe Israel off the face of the earth. So all of these news items were influencing my, I guess, had anti-Semitism on my radar. So it wasn't anti-Semitism in a domestic sense. It was more in a sort of like geopolitical sense. And that is what made me want to fight against it. And so then I started doing Israel advocacy. But then I noticed that Israel advocacy suffered from the same things that my experience with my religion suffered from, which was a kind of dogmatic us versus them binary way of thinking. And it wasn't until I stopped reading Israeli polemics, or I guess political books about Israel, and started reading Israeli literature that I began to say, I've been doing this wrong this entire time. And the reason for that is that literature in general, and Israeli literature in particular, is able to present a language that can capture the messiness of the human condition as it pertains to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in a way that doesn't dehumanize Israelis or Palestinians. Whereas if you enter the political sphere, especially today, almost inevitably, you get into binary ways of thinking. You get into that, if you're in this box, you're good. If you're in that box, you're bad. And so once I started reading Israeli literature, that's when I was given really a better vocabulary to find a way to love Israel, which is different from idolizing Israel. And I think so much of my advocacy was actually informed by an idolization as opposed to love, which requires acceptance of the messiness, of the imperfections, of the shortcomings of another people, even as it requires acceptance of the messiness and the imperfections and the shortcomings of yourself. So that was certainly a huge piece of the puzzle that created Theory of Enchantment.
I've got two questions for you about that. And so, firstly, what specifically was the literature you read? What books should I be reading then? That inspired that, or maybe give me one or two. I don't want a whole library.
Yes,
set me in the direction. And then the other question is, you to show to care about anti-Semitism, but then you're jumping to caring about Israel, and those are separate things. Mm-hmm. I mean, obviously they're linked, but you can care about anti-Semitism without being a Zionist, for example.
Sure.
Or you might be more sympathetic to Palestine when it comes to the Israel-Palestine conflict, but also care about anti-Semitism across the world. How did you make that step from anti-Semitism to caring specifically about to the point that you were advocating for Israel?
Yeah, I think for me, and I'm trying to remember because this was a long time ago, but I think for me, it was a lot of things. It was understanding that it was kind of unfair to see every other people be given or be recognized for their rights to national self-determination, except for the Jews. I thought historically that was certainly a part of anti-Semitism. But it was also, and this is much more of I would say, do you know Reinhold Niebuhr? Are you familiar with it? Oh my God, what's that? Okay. You should definitely read his works. He was like a really famous 20th century Protestant theologian. Really brilliant. And I think that there's this, when it comes to anti-Zionism in particular, I think that there's this this sense that nationalism, all nationalism is, I'm going to what do you call it? The opposite of straw manning. I'm going to steel man anti-Zionism for a second. The idea that all nationalism is flawed because nationalism inherently means some kind of othering of people who don't belong to that nationalistic identity, right? America notwithstanding, America's a little bit different, but most countries, most nations have a very specific manifestation or very specific people who they claim to be fulfilling the national rights of. And so if I were to steelman anti-Zionism, I would say it's a form of anti-nationalism, and it perceives nationalism as a great evil. I think, Niebuhrian retort to that would be that there's no such thing as a world without imperfection. In other words, the idea that we can move to this sort of like teleologically utopian state where there's so much, there's like absolute perfection and no mistakes are made and blood is on no one's hands. And, even in the pursuit of justice, blood is on no one's hands. I think that's a fundamentally flawed understanding of the human condition. And I don't think it's desirable either. And I grew up with this sort of teleological idea, the idea that the world is moving towards a fixed state or a perfect state in which human beings will be perfect and it will be a utopia and we will all live in absolute perfection with each other. And James Carse has also influenced my thinking on this in his book, Finite and Infinite Games, where he says, actually, the pursuit of evil, or excuse me, the proliferation of evil often comes when people try to completely eradicate evil from the face of the earth, because they're basically not realizing that we're all in a fallen state. So I think when it comes to nationalism and when it comes to anti-Zionism in particular, I'm very much pro self-determination for all peoples. And I know that self-determination, national self-determination, national self-actualization presupposes, by definition, that mistakes will be made, that sins will be committed, and that harm will be done. But I think that the very fabric of reality would cease to exist if that wasn't a possibility. And I think that, historically speaking, certainly in the West, it is a curious thing, not simply to tell the Jewish people that they're not entitled to self-determination, but to also tell them, essentially, that they're not allowed to make mistakes. And I think this is a different argument from what I would have said back in the day when I was in college. There's this underlying, I think, idea within anti-Zionism that the Jews and the Jews alone are not allowed to make mistakes on a nationalistic level. Now, obviously, we would want the Jewish people to get better, like we would want any person or any group of people to get better at doing whatever it is they're doing on a nationalistic level. But I do think that anti-Zionism has this particular, makes this particular exception in that it says that the Jews alone are not able to self-actualize in a national way and are not able to make mistakes because they're not able to self-actualize, which presupposes that mistakes will be made in the first place. That was a very long-winded answer.
Well, the retort by sorry, with what's the name with an N?
Niebuhr. Yeah, Reinhold Niebuhr. Yeah.
So his retort by saying that the world is imperfect and mistakes will happen is a defensive. It's not really an argument for something. It's a defense of something. Whereas the right to determination, as you describe it, or self-determination is the positive argument. And actually, there's did he make that case, or are you making that case?
Did he make which case? That one's positive and one's negative?
The Jews have, or let's say if you're anti-nationalism altogether, the right to self-determination, is that you're saying that you think, is that your argument or his argument? Sorry.
It's a combination.
Okay. Well, there's an Israeli writer, conservative writer called Yoram Hazori, who wrote a book called, I think it's called The Case for Nationalism. And this book actually kind of spun me out a little bit, because nationalism for me has always been a dirty word. And I was brought up, understanding Nazism, and in that sense, it was an evil ideology. And then this book, where he talks about the history of nationalism, very much about self-determination, and it doesn't mean any sort of jingoism. It doesn't mean attacking your neighbors. Quite the contrary, he uses the Old Testament, and unfortunately, I read it a few years ago, so it isn't totally fresh to mind. But he shows how it is almost nationalistic scripture, or this need for a Jewish homeland, but it's very much about loving the neighbors outside that nation. So there is a sort of positive argument for nationalism there, although that's that I'm sure will be spun in all sorts of bad faith. I
am familiar with Yoram Hazoni's work. I don't know. I mean, he always strikes me as his writing, and I haven't read the book, but I've read some of his articles. His writing strikes me as not being sufficiently honest about the perils of nationalism. Nationalism is not a perfect thing. Again, I'm very like hesitant to adopt this idea that like this one container for some human experiment is perfect and ideal, even if humans fall short of it. I mean, there's no such thing really. And so one of the things I find very lacking in his thesis is the serious and easy ways in which nationalism can give way to jingoism and can give way to, all of those kind of stereotypical things that we associate with nationalism, which is why I do think the sort of defense of nationalism from the more negative perspective is arguably a more honest perspective, which is to say that obviously we want to contain those impulses, which of course exists within every single one of us. We want to contain those impulses, but it is the failure to give human beings the chance to be imperfect, or to acknowledge that human beings are imperfect. That is really what's at the core of the problem with any form of anti-nationalism.
I think I get a little bit tripped up, or I used to get tripped up on the word itself, where because nationalism has all those other negative connotations, maybe we need a new word like nation-statism. But at the same time, you don't want to ignore all those evil tendencies that can occur. So maybe it's not helpful to go all the way in that direction.
And I think that one of the other problems with anti-nationalists and with anti-Zionists in particular is that they fail to understand that those very impulses that they dislike are not going to suddenly disappear if the nation state disappears. is going to manifest in a completely different iteration, but they're baked into human nature, right? And that comes from a psychological foundation. And again, it's this utopian mindset that, I mean, it's certainly tripped me up in the past, but I think that that's what continues to trip us up today, because we see ourselves as potentially hurling towards this future perfect utopian state, which is not, in my opinion, not a thing. I mean,
that's the progressive fallacy. The arc towards. I don't believe at all. I'm not sure this is what I'm implying that the universe is this long arc towards more justice. I don't think that at all. There's plenty of examples in history where evil and justice. Look at the 20th century after all this long arc, and there's never more evil in one period of time. Sorry, that's what you meant.
Well, the paradox, I was talking to a friend about this last week. The paradox is that human beings are teleological. We are purpose-driven. We are goal-oriented, right? But the universe is not. And so how do you reconcile these two things? This is something that I'm working on within myself as a matter of self-work, because I grew up with such a framework that claimed that the universe was teleologically moving towards something when in fact it's not. And I've found solace in studying a lot of wisdom traditions from the East to balance the wisdom traditions from the West that I was raised with. But that seems to me to be one of the biggest dilemmas for us to make sense of, because we are goal-oriented and we are purpose-driven. That's part of what it means to be human. And yet the universe is not. And so how do we make sense of that is the question.
So can you expand on that dilemma? Sorry, just because you'll have done more thinking on this than me. So how does that dilemma manifest itself?
I mean, I can try. I don't know if I fully fleshed it out for myself. So I'll give you an example. I'm trying to work on the art of relationship for me in my personal life. And what I've realized is that relationship is not some separate thing that exists apart from me. Relationship is the very fabric of the universe. If you study physics, quantum physics, for example, this is what we've come to know. Like, everything is relational. And so I've been studying a lot of Jung and Jungian writers who are super into the art and practice of relationship. And so there's a central question of what does it mean to relate to both oneself and to another human being, and to constantly practice that. Relationship is, in a way, goalless, right? The purpose of a relationship is actually not to get to some other place. The purpose of a relationship is to learn how to relate. And it's hard to shift from a previous dichotomy, which saw relationship as this separate thing, as this kind of also like baggage heavy thing. It's also hard to shift from a mentality where you're constantly asking yourself, what do I need? What actions do I need to take? What do I need to do in order to advance something? As opposed to asking a question, who do I need to be? Right? Doing and being are two different things. And we have developed the vocabulary and the, I guess, activities for doing in our society, but we're less good at learning how to be. And so for me, specifically, personally, I'm trying to figure out that question of like, how do I actively learn to relate without catastrophizing in my head, without, one of the things that social media does is it causes us to to see people not as people to relate to, but as people to see as sort of instruments to advance a certain ideology or advance a certain position, right? How can I, because that's very toxic. So how can I get rid of that way in which I have seen other people and start instead to learn how to relate? So that's how that dilemma is manifesting in my life personally right now.
How does that tie in with your Christian upbringing?
Well, I don't know. I mean, I have some sensibilities about that, but I'm sort of teasing it out. I mean, the Jungian, Carl Jung's sort of interpretation of Christianity is very different from the traditional, I guess, religious interpretation of Christianity. Jung saw Christianity as a kind of symbolic story that would give people the capacity to take responsibility for their own suffering, basically, which is very different from the. It's very different to say Jesus died for my sins and rose from the dead, and now I am saved, and that is my relationship with Jesus. It's very different to say that as opposed to saying Jesus was a figure who took responsibility for his own suffering and modeled a way to take responsibility for one's own suffering. And so that is what I'm going to try to do in my own way, right? That's a very different relationship with Jesus, the man, versus Jesus, the deity. So I think I'm leaning more into the direction of the latter.
It was striking me that my understanding the genius of Christianity from a psychological point of view, and I'm not a theologian nor a psychologist, so keep that in mind, is that it's not about being nor necessarily relating, but rather about serving. And it is true that if you serve others before yourself, you actually transcend yourself. And that is where you will find not only what is most meaningful, but also it will bring you the most happiness and joy and self-fulfillment. And so that for me, when I understood that and understood the genius that this works, even if you remove the metaphysics from Christianity, from Jesus, the message is true as well psychologically, and it will set you free actually in how you act in the world.
Yeah, I do think that if you center service as a way of life, if that's what a person gets from Christianity, then that's right. Like, your life will be fulfilled. And yet I struggle with picking a religion to convert to, because so many wisdom traditions have that same message. It's almost, I mean, the way I relate to it is that God, whatever you think God is manifested in all of these different wisdom traditions. And for me personally, I find it fulfilling to sample from a lot of them, which I am doing right now in my own personal life.
What does sampling mean? Does that mean believing it or learning from it?
I don't know what the word belief means anymore, really. So I would say more learning from it.
So it's not really a pick and mix religion, but rather, because that's a great thing to do, is to read about all of those, and there's so much wisdom to take from it. But even bring this back to theory of enchantment, why I like it so much from that perspective is that in your approach, you're actually serving the people you're trying to help, because you're not saying you need to change and be like this.
Right.
Instead, you're saying, what happened? Like, how are you? What happened? How have you got to this place where you have this kind of, maybe it's hate or maybe it's animosity towards others, and you're not trying to convert them. Instead, you're trying to love them and help them through whatever difficulties they have. And so I see that as a very Christian approach. Or perhaps there's other religions that you could also be considered in the same.
There's definitely, I can never sort of exorcise myself of Christianity just because it's a part of my upbringing. It's a part of the paradigm through which or the perspective through which I view the world. So I can never get rid of it in that sense. So it's definitely there within Theory of Enchantment. I think it's more, what the metaphor that I would use is like cultivating a garden, or the idea of attending to a garden is something that really resonates with me. I have a lot of plants. I'm into that. So Theory of Enchantment is sort of like trying to cultivate gardens within people in a sense, and bring forth their higher selves, if you will, through the process of very long and patient kind of attending to. So, by the way, I forgot to mention, because you asked me for a book recommendation.
Yes, please.
Amos Oz, A Tale of Love and Darkness, is an excellent book.
And is that the Israeli literature you were referring to earlier?
Yes.
Okay. And why should I read that book?
You should read that book because it doesn't, instead of trafficking in boxes to describe the Israeli and Palestinian communities, it uses the language of the human condition. It understands tragedy. And I mean, it really understands tragedy, because one of the interesting things that I've learned about the human condition is that if we feel angry about something, or if we are experiencing anger towards someone, if we don't allow ourselves to drop into sorrow, then that anger can fester and eat us up and eat us alive. And then we can just really, totally create havoc or wreak havoc as a result of that anger, which is like fire that burns us up. But if we can drop into sorrow, this is where the blues tradition comes from. In America, if we can drop into sorrow and allow ourselves to sit with the sorrow and allow ourselves to mourn, then that can actually help us develop the capacity for empathy and compassion, both for our own long suffering and for others. And that's what A Tale of Love and Darkness does. It's a sorrowful book about the traumas and the pains of both Israelis and Palestinians. And that in turn enables the reader to cultivate empathy and compassion for both communities.
Certainly that's absolutely jumped to the top of my reading list there. So the way you're talking about Christianity is, this is very personal, so we can just move along. But you sort of, it's almost as if you're saying you can't escape it, but you don't necessarily believe it. Is that what you're sort of implying?
I don't believe. It's like when Jordan Peterson says it depends on what you mean by believe. He has this typical retort that he does when people ask him similar questions, and it's hard to give an answer, Winston. It's like I have much more of a symbolic relationship with. That's the difference. I don't take these stories literally anymore. I take them symbolically. Now, some people will say, "Oh, that means you don't believe it," and some people will say, "Oh, that means you do believe it." So it depends on your relationship with symbolism. I grew up in a very literalist house, and so I definitely am no longer a literalist, but I certainly believe in it symbolically. So,
okay. So you, as you said, you're brought up on the Old Testament, literature, but those stories are just as valuable, symbolically as they were.
For sure, yeah. I mean, I think they're even more valuable symbolically. I think I can no longer read religious texts, any religious text, literally. They don't make sense to me literally. Like the story of Adam and Eve doesn't make sense to me literally, but symbolically. And Jordan Peterson talks a lot about this in some of his lectures. Symbolically, it's an incredible story. Symbolically, it actually makes sense. Well, literally, it doesn't make sense to me.
I guess, and I'm conscious that I'm going to eventually run into a wall where I'm not going to be able to express myself with words. But when it comes to the story of Christ, which is the great story, and not just symbolically, but also all his parables are unbelievably helpful. And it was a radical philosophy that came and really goes against so much human nature. It's a really brilliant and radical philosophy, which you can take so much from, but it also has to be true for it to be truly.
Does it? Why?
Because if it's not true, then it's not to be taken. Why take any of it seriously?
Like, what do you mean by true?
If he is not the Son of God, if he did not die for our sins and rise again, then none of it needs to be taken seriously. It's just another story.
I have so many book recommendations for you, but I don't want
to. You want someone else to argue with me?
No, it's not. It's once I've shifted from a literal perspective to a symbolic perspective, it's a completely different paradigm, and it's impossible to capture in a 60-minute podcast. Okay, but Winston.
Talk to me.
You are an artist. You are a musician, right? Music is one of those things that is symbolic, right? I mean, music is not a literal experience in the sense that I think of the word literalism. It's a symbolic experience. I hear music and I'm expanded. I hear a certain melody, and somehow I'm filled with an emotion. How's that possible? I didn't even, So music is something that is an instrument that can give us a symbolic experience. And so it doesn't have to be, I don't even know what it would mean for music to be literally true. I don't even know what that would mean. And yet we know that music is true, So I don't know if that made any sense, but
yeah, I think the way the analogy works is, if I use my analogy about Christ, then it would be to say that the music doesn't have to be literally true, and you don't ignore it. But I think from a philosophical point of view, there's so much you of course can take from all religions, as you've described. And I do, by the way, as well. Mm-hmm. I read across them. But if it's not true, then so what? A little bit. Or I guess maybe I would go into saying if it maybe this is more into sort of Dostoevsky territory, but if it's not. If it's not true, then anything is permissible, and so we have a we choose to take good from these parables and these stories, but we're not obliged to. But we need to be obliged to. I'm getting. I think I'm out of my depth.
No, I understand what you mean. I think I understand what you mean. And yet there's part of me wants to answer that if a person is not of their own volition compelled to serve, if you will, to serve the divine, let's put it that way, in some capacity, then and if they are simply doing it out of convention, right? If they're simply doing it because they have been mandated to do it, because of the society that they were born in, etc., then one could say that is actually not a genuine relationship with the divine in the first place. And then the point is missed. The actual point is missed. Dun, dun, dun.
Yeah. Okay, I'll tweet at you my response.
I probably won't see it because I've been taking breaks from Twitter, but I'll see it eventually.
That's probably been quite good for you to take breaks from Twitter.
It's been incredible, honestly.
I'll fill you in. It's been great fun. Elon Musk's taking over, and then, or they're maybe not taking over. He's going to bring Trump back. It's going crazy. It's so much.
So exciting! Wow.
Yeah, super exciting. So, what's next for Theory of Enchantment? You say you hope to be the number one.
That'd be so cool.
Who is number one?
Oh, I don't know.
Robin DiAngelo.
I don't know. You.
I don't know.
No, it's definitely not me. It's definitely not me. No, it's definitely not me. The entire landscape, it's hard to tell like what anyone's doing or like how big they are. But I have big dreams, big hopes and dreams. I look at companies like Apple. I look at companies like Disney. I look at companies like Nike. These are all companies that I deeply admire just for what they were able to do, the impact they were able to have in the world. And I would love Theory of Enchantment to have the same magnitude of impact in the world. And it would be really cool also because Theory of Enchantment is such a, it's almost like a hospitality thing, because it's trying to teach people the art of care and that art of relationship. And if a company whose essential service that it's selling is to teach people how to love could be as big as Apple, that would be just like I would feel that my life was fulfilled, basically.
That's great. Well, I fully support your dreams there. The
Thank
church
you.
is the Theory of Enchantment.
No, that's not what I'm saying. That's not what I'm saying. That is not what I am saying. Let it be known, folks. This is not what I'm saying at all. No. Absolutely not. Oh, I did want to ask you some questions, by the way, about because I told you this. I am a huge fan of Mumford and Sons. I was a huge fan since I was 15 years old. You guys were the first band to put Play-Doh into music form for the 21st century. And I am curious about how some of those bands' lyrics resonate with you, given everything that's happened since you left. I wanted to ask you about a couple lyrics, if that's okay. To see if they stir something in you, or
those three guys are very talented, and they're three great songwriters. And I couldn't possibly. I don't know what songs you're going to reference, but
they're all from Sigh No More, for the record.
So if they're songs that one of the other guys has written, I'll be like you, a fan of the song. Okay. So, but I don't know if I'll be able to give you any more intel than the next fan. If that's what I mean.
Yeah, I mean that's fine. Let's try one or two, just to see what happens.
Well, I should actually say I only wrote one song on that record. So
which one was it?
And that was "Winter Winds." So so almost certainly I'm coming at this as a fan like you.
So I want you to think of these lyrics though in light of everything that's happened to you, not simply as like an abstract thing, hanging in the wind. I know it's symbolic, but it might also be true, Okay. Which one do I want to ask you about? I will ask you about just this one. Love, it will not betray you, dismay, or enslave you. It will set you free. Be more like the man you were made to be.
You know what? No, I'm glad you choose that one. That's that's a lyric from the title track for the record, Sigh No More. And lyrics are written by the singer Marcus. And those are great lyrics. And they are sort of, hearing you say that again, they do resonate in a new way. In that, and again, to kind of use a it depends on what you mean by love, I guess. But if truth is in any way part of love, and the pursuit of ideals above the worldly, and which is love is not a worldly thing, even though it's within the world. It's a force greater than this world, and in pursuit of that, it is liberating, even if you give up, even if that means, and it meant for me, I guess, giving up a lot of worldly things. I have been liberated by that. And so I do believe that to be very, very true, and a very great lyric.
Awesome. Thank you for indulging me.
Well, actually, you should tell your listeners, because when we met in New York, confessed that you had written in lockdown 1.0.
Oh, yes.
In 2020, you had spent your time creating a kind of somewhat of a thesis on the Sigh No More album, and I think you probably know more about that record lyrically and philosophically than perhaps any other human being on earth, including the authors.
I find it very hard to believe, but I will certainly take the compliment. Yes, I did write basically a fan book on Sigh No More, where I took each lyric or took each song and analyzed all of the lyrics and analyzed all of the references. I'm sure I missed some references, but analyzed all of the references that I was aware of. And I didn't have anything else to do, so that's what I did.
Well, it's pretty impressive, and I hope you publish it one day. I've certainly enjoyed reading it.
Thank you. Maybe I'll link to it for this podcast.
That's super tight. It's certainly better use of time than what I did in my lockdown. I decided I was going to write the history of the banjo.
Wow, that's cool.
I did all the research and read all the books.
I think that's cool.
By the way, the history of the banjo is pretty amazing history, because it's basically the history of America, and it's a really dark history, but there's also some real beauty to it as well. An instrument born very much that could not have existed if not for the slave trade, and kind of came out of the Caribbean and eventually north. It was created from the memory of various instruments across Africa, and many years after those Africans had moved or been moved. Been taken to the Western Hemisphere, and because all the different Africans were from different parts of, it was a faded memory. They didn't even necessarily have the same language to speak with each other, and the instrument that came out was the kind of collective memory in it. And then it evolved over time. Then it kind of interacts with poor white communities, and actually there's, from that dark origin, there's some amazing stories of how poor whites and poor blacks started making music together, and this was been hundreds of years later, with the banjo at the center, and then it goes back into darkness again with the minstrel show, which is white people in blackface. And that's actually how it first came to my country, England. It was an American minstrel show, a guy called Sweeney, I think, in the early 19th century. I can't remember exactly. Actually, there was I think an African American banjo player who's buried in Brompton Cemetery in the middle of London, and he came over to teach Queen Victoria's son, then Prince of Wales, wanted to learn the banjo, and this guy came over as part of a tour and then stayed to teach Prince banjo. It's something like that. But anyway, that information is anyway. I did all that research, and maybe I'll one day. I have actually been asked by a college to do a sort of lecture on the history of the banjo for Ralston College, which is a new college that actually Jordan Peterson is the chancellor of in Savannah, Georgia. Which I may do that. I've got to dig up all my work on it, but. Yeah. Anyway, the story of the banjo is the story of America, and with all this tragedy and beauty tied up in one.
That sounds like a very cool thing that you did during the beginning of 2020.
It's fucking geeky. I'm not sure anyone wants to read it. I think I'd watch a lecture, but am I going to read a book? Nah.
Well, listen. I think the key is to just include music, like include musical experiences as a part of the lecture. I think that would really have it come alive. You know.
Yeah.
I would totally attend that lecture if it had the music. I would be more inclined.
If it had the music.
I would be more inclined to attend if it had the music component. I'm curious, are you working on any music? Are you producing any music right now?
I am, yeah. I'm working on a few projects, doing some songwriting. I was doing songwriting kept that sort of that muscle exercise through the pandemic, and working on a record. Or I'm not sure I can say yet because.
Okay.
But I'm working on a record with someone we mutually know. But I'll let you know in due course, and then hopefully over the next few months I'll be able to sort of talk more about it. But
okay.
Yeah, I'll let you know for sure. Do your fans know about your music?
Well, now that you said something, Winston, I'm sure some of them know. I've definitely talked about it here and there on Twitter and stuff like that. I do have an album. It's a very poorly produced album, but it is on Spotify. And I produced most of it in 2018. And I was having a musical year, you know. And I am slowly but surely getting back into music production. Like I've been putting together some sketches of some new songs in the past few weeks. So I feel the spirit is moving me again towards that. But I also have a few sets on SoundCloud. So I also like to DJ in my spare time. And I also have a few other songs that haven't been released on Spotify that are on SoundCloud, my SoundCloud, if anyone wants to check that out. So thank you for that layup.
I set them up and you slapped them. No, it's great. I was really taken aback when I heard your music. First, because I remember you sampled Something Soweto, who
who I love so much. So
yeah,
good.
Absolutely love that guy. So I was thrilled that there's someone else outside of South Africa who'd actually heard of him.
Yeah.
Sorry, I didn't mean that as a dig to Something because he's sick.
He's incredible. I can't wait to, when he comes to New York. I mean, I would love to see him in South Africa, but when he comes to New York, I would love to see him perform.
Is he coming?
No, I don't. He doesn't have any plans, but I'm just like speaking that into existence,
But then also your DJ sets, I enjoyed them as well. And it's one thing I've noticed in this new world I found myself in of writers and thinkers and intellectuals like yourself is that there are a lot of young thinkers who have musical bones. And one of the projects that I can't yet talk about is kind of based on that, and I wonder if for example, Coleman Hughes, who's in New York as well, he's just put his album out, and he's a great writer and a great young thinker and a great guy. And there's many people like that. And I wonder if there's a cool way of bringing it all together. And maybe it's a symposium, maybe it's a collaborative record, but I think that's something I've been very curious about, and maybe we should talk about that.
Yeah.
Off camera.
Yeah. Yeah, that would be very cool. I mean, that would be something else. Can you imagine like Coleman Hughes on one track, you on another track, me on another track? That would be sick, actually. Yeah, that'd be pretty tight. I'm definitely down to chat after if you'd like. But in general, what I've been trying to do is help inform my intellectual sort of takes with the art more, and have all of my thought processes be informed by the artistry, which for me requires being off social media more, allowing myself to grow my capacities to be receptive, right? Because social media is constantly like, it's creating ADD in us, it's like we're constantly vying for likes and tweets, and then we lose the capacity to sit and to be with what is, as opposed to constantly trying to get somewhere or, do something. So that's part of my attempt to cultivate relationship, the art of relationship in my life as well. And so I want the art to lead whatever I do, really. The artistic orientation.
Yeah, I think for sure. I mean, horrible is the sort of the idea that in hundreds of years, this kind of stamp we leave on the world is our Twitter feed or our search history, which actually probably is the stamp. If our ancestors probably will look that shit up, which is a horrible thought. But much better to invest that energy into creating beautiful things and music and art in all its myriad forms than just tweeting into the abyss. So yes. I'll have to follow your lead and try and spend a little less time on social media.
Go into music.
Enchanting though social media is.
Yes. Oh goodness, it's like enchanting in the sense that like the sirens in Odysseus, who exactly. It's like that, but it's not actually. If you don't plug your ears, or if you don't have your men plug their ears, they might drown in the sea. So it's something that we have to be very cautious of.
Amen. Well, on that note,
thank you for coming on the Heart Speaks podcast. This podcast, by the way, went in so many different directions that I was not expecting at all, but I'm really happy with it. I'm grateful to you for coming on and having a conversation.
Thank you.
Let me know when you're in New York and we'll hang. And in the meantime, I wish you the very best on all of the projects that you are working on.
Thank you, Chloe. And I look forward to seeing New York. And if your listeners enjoyed this conversation, I'm going to do a little...
Yeah, do it.
I hope that they might enjoy Marshall Matters with me, Winston Marshall. It's a spectator show interviewing people in the creative industries. So I hope that they might enjoy that as well. But anyway, Chloe, I'm really grateful for you having me on, and you're just wonderful in every way.
Oh, thank you, Winston. I hope to see you soon. Take care.